The Finance Sector Union is calling for even more regulation from the federal government to rid the banking sector of its sales-oriented operations, instead focusing back on good customer service for the Australian people.
Our regulation doesn't go far enough. For example, in Australia, we still have the unregulated, to a large extent, sale of credit. People get unsolicited letters at home saying, do you want a credit card? Do you want an increase in your credit card limit? There is no proper regulation of credit in this country. We have been saying for a long time that every single bank in this country should be signed up to a charter of responsible lending that only talks about dealing with the genuine needs of the customer, rather than this do you want fries with that mentality when you walk into a bank branch. You might go in there to do a deposit, but you walk out of there having a 20-minute spiel about do you want an extra mortgage? Do you want an extra credit card? What can we do to sell you more debt? And more in our industry now, how much somebody gets paid, or even whether they get to keep their job, comes down to whether they meet an arbitrary sales target. And those targets aren't about service, they're about sales. People trust banks, and so they should. They are very important pillars of our community. So if you get a letter from the bank that says, we've pre-approved an increase in your credit card limit, then most customers think, well, that bank must have done an assessment. It must think that I can afford it. So they sign it and send it back. There is a trust element which is being betrayed at the moment by the banks. When they continue to push sell rather than service, we have seen that more and more people aren't trusting banks. And that is a very, very bad thing. And we want our industry to go back to the days where if you said you worked for a bank, it was a responsible job, it meant something, and it mainly meant that you looked after the customer. Which is why it's a complete tragedy that St George was allowed to be swallowed up by Westpac. That was a bank that had no sales targets, no performance pay. They went out of their way to say that is not the culture that we have, which is why they became very successful. They were the 5th biggest bank, and what happens? They get swallowed up by Westpac, and that whole culture disappears overnight.
So we've now got this unparalleled territory. We've got 90% of the market dominated by 4 big players, and competition, to the extent you can call it competition, being now the responsibility of small players like Members Equity. Now we think we're up to the task, and we think we've got a model that over time will introduce competition. Our point though is that government and the community and unions and industry funds in particular, I think, have got an interest in making sure that we do have a competitive banking market.
You are now finding a lot of customers and workers who are leaving the big 4 banks and say, we're sick of that sales. We want to go somewhere where that sales mentality isn't part of what we do every day.
If you go back 15 years, we used to have state banks, and we had a Commonwealth Bank, and they were government banks. And
which bank? The Commonwealth Bank, Australia's leading bank.
And the government at that time felt that it was important to have state-owned entities in the banking system to ensure there was, a community interest. It's an essential community service, like telecommunications or water or power. That's the way it should be seen.
Which is why those banks were set up.
Which is why those banks were set up. And then, as we said, during this sort of deregulatory phase and, a more free market, open market orthodoxy which sort of swept the world, it was all decided we'll dispense with that. The government retreated from that space, and the ACTU in particular, with Bill and others, and industry super funds have said, no, there's a gap here. There's a social need for a financial institution that acts in customers' and members' interests. And that's been our mission over the last 10 years as a bank, and industry super the last 20 years. So that's our mission.
The credit union movement came out of the union movement. It's about that collective notion. It's about standing for something which is a collective nature rather than profit is the be-all and end-all. And, and the credit unions, by and large, do a fantastic job looking after their customers.
So we've now got this unparalleled territory. We've got 90% of the market dominated by 4 big players, and competition, to the extent you can call it competition, being now the responsibility of small players like Members Equity. Now we think we're up to the task, and we think we've got a model that over time will introduce competition. Our point though is that government and the community and unions and industry funds in particular, I think, have got an interest in making sure that we do have a competitive banking market. We're at a point now, I think, it's a real tipping point. I think it's a very exciting time because I think we can actually now very confidently go forward and say, we actually are the antithesis of everything that's caused the current crisis. We are the antithesis of that. We act in members' interests. We don't act short term. We're not driven by profit sharing or incentives or sales commissions. We have products that are open and transparent and disclosed in the members' interest. So, yes, it's a harder thing. It's not as sexy, and in boom times it may not have the sort of returns that the private equity might have. But it's sustainable. It'll survive a crisis, and it won't actually cause a crisis. It won't get into irresponsible lending or subprime lending or behave in a way that's hostile to our stakeholders' interests. We've started a discussion with the ACTU and with industry super funds. We think there's a group of people coming together to actually say, well, now's the time to actually put forward what we think the alternative vision should be for a mutually owned financial services conglomerate that has demonstrated that it outperforms in good times, outperforms in bad times, can sustain a crisis, acts in members' interests, is governed properly and prudently. Now is the time for that model to be recognised by government and be given. We're not asking for a leg up, we're not asking for favouritism. What we'd like is a level field, just an opportunity to compete, to demonstrate our capability.